Welcome along, strange historians. This is the Strange History Podcast. I hopefully am your favorite strange historian. Before I begin, please like and share this episode and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Oh, and do me a favor and check out the links below to learn how to support my channel. So now sit back and pour yourself a cup of coffee or a tankard of tea or a mug of mead or a chalice of cider or a flagon filled with any beverage of your choice and join your fellow strange historians around the campfire. Before I begin, please like and share this episode and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell and check out the links below to learn how to support my research and productions, namely by becoming a member of my channel and also becoming a member on Patreon, both of which get exclusive content, including original time travel style stories. And this time around, we're going to be talking about the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Imagine, the year is 1865. It is the springtime. In Virginia, there is a man named John Wilkes Booth. He was born in 1838, being the ninth of 10 children. On April 26 of this year, he will turn 26 years old. He is a well-known American stage actor who is a member of the prominent Booth theatrical family. The Booth family, along with their slaves, lived on a farm near Bel Air, Maryland. Having begun his career by appearing in Richard III when he was just 17 years of age, some critics have called Booth, as I quote, the handsomest man in America, end quote. He stands 5 feet 8 inches tall. He has curling black hair. He is lean, athletic, and muscular. He has a history of leaping upon the stage and gesturing with great passion as he recites his lines. As a result of his strikingly handsome appearance and the romantic personal attraction women have for him, he has quickly become a celebrity with theatergoers. His highly successful acting career for a Shakespearean company has taken him all over the United States. Nearly everyone who is anyone knows who he is, including politicians in Washington, D.C. In fact, on November 9, 1863, President Abraham Lincoln watched Booth play Raphael in the play Marbleheart at Ford's Theater. Over the course of the last 6+ years, Booth has become very wealthy. He currently earns well over $20,000 a year. Despite all the good fortune that has been bestowed upon him, Booth is an angry young man. He is filled with rage because of his hatred for President Abraham Lincoln. On top of that, he laments the recent abolition of slavery in the United States. Booth became politically active in the 1850s, joining the Know Nothing Party, which is an organization devoted to reducing the stream of immigrants into the United States. Booth ardently supported the institution of slavery, and in 1859, he joined a Virginia company that aided in the capture of John Brown after his raid at Harper's Ferry. In fact, Booth was an eyewitness to John Brown's execution. And during the Civil War, Booth worked as a Confederate secret agent. As a result, Booth began formulating plans to abduct President Abraham Lincoln. The plan called for the president to be taken south to Richmond, Virginia, where he would be held until exchanged for Confederate prisoners of war. It was Booth's mission to recruit friends and known Southern sympathizers for his mission. On March 4, 1865, President Lincoln was inaugurated for his second term. John Wilkes Booth was present in Washington for the inauguration. Booth was filled with rage. 11 days later, on March 15, 1865, Booth arranged for a meeting at a well-known restaurant on Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. Those in attendance include John Surratt. John Surratt was born on April 13, 1844, in the Washington, D.C. District of Congress Heights. He is 21 years old. Surratt intends to become a priest. He is currently enrolled at St. Charles College in Maryland. In 1863, Surratt was working as a Confederate secret agent, carrying messages to Confederate boats on the Potomac River, and sending messages about Union troop movements in the Washington area south to Richmond. Next to him is his mother, Mary. She was born in Waterloo, Maryland, and schooled in a Catholic female seminary. No one seems to be sure exactly what year it was when she was born, but she's roughly 45 years old. She married John Surratt at age 17, and in 1853 the Surratts bought 287 acres of land, about a 2-hour horse ride from Washington. She is the owner of a boarding house in Washington, D.C. Next to her is Lewis Powell. He is the youngest boy in a family of 8 children. Born in Alabama on April 22, 1844, his family lived in Georgia counties and Florida. Lewis is 21 years old. He is a quiet, introverted youth. Wounded at Gettysburg on July 2, 1863, Powell was captured by Union troops. During September of 1863, he escaped. And Powell was soon introduced to John Surratt, who in turn introduced him to John Wilkes Booth. Also in attendance is David Herold. He is the 6th of 11 children. He was born on June 16, 1842. He is currently 22 years old. Herold met John Surratt while attending Charlotte Hall Academy, and through Surratt, in 1863, Herold was introduced to John Wilkes Booth. Seated next to him can be seen Michael O'Laughlin. He was born on June 3, 1840. He is currently 24 years old. He grew up on the same Baltimore street as his childhood friend, John Wilkes Booth. O'Laughlin has worked as a manufacturer of ornamental plaster before joining the Confederate Army at the beginning of the Civil War. O'Laughlin was discharged in June of 1862, and he returned to Baltimore to work as a clerk in a family feed business. To his left is Edmund Spangler. He was born in York, Pennsylvania on August 10, 1825. He is 39 years old. During the Civil War, Spangler worked at Ford's Theater in Washington as a carpenter and scene shifter. He is a heavy drinker who usually can be found sleeping in the theater. It was through his work at Ford's that Spangler met actor John Wilkes Booth. Spangler often tended to Booth's horse when he was at the theater. Also at the table can be seen Samuel Arnold, who was born in Washington, D.C. on September 6, 1834. He is 30 years old. The Arnold family later moved to Baltimore. Arnold attended St. Timothy's Military Academy, where he was a classmate of John Wilkes Booth. Last summer, in 1864, Booth recruited Arnold, then unemployed and bored, to join the conspiracy to abduct President Lincoln. And next to him is German-born George Atzerodt. He immigrated to the United States with his family in 1843 at the age of 8. He was born on June 12, 1835. He is 29 years old. During the Civil War, Atzerodt helped Confederate agents, including John Surratt, cross the Potomac River. Surratt invited Atzerodt to Washington, where he stayed for a time at Mary Surratt's boarding house. Through the Surratts, Atzerodt met John Wilkes Booth. It is during this meeting where many of the conspirators meet for the first time. And it is at this time, for the first time, that John Wilkes Booth reveals his plan to everybody. The restaurant is not crowded on this night, but Booth looks around in every direction. He doesn't even want a waiter to pass by to fill up a glass of water. Booth cannot let anyone hear what he is telling them? No one. And that is because no one around, except for those who are at the table with him, can be trusted. One never knows where anyone's true loyalty lies. And so, one must tread very carefully in life with whom one tells their secrets. But Booth knows these people. He knows that anything he tells them will remain with them. Because when you tell people things in private during personal conversations, it's best to keep them to yourself. And so, he takes a sip of water, he leans in closer to the table, as do the others, and he unveils his plan, which is to abduct the President of the United States, Abraham Lincoln. They all sit still, so still, in fact, that it seems as if the slightest breeze to come through the opening of the front door could possibly knock some of them over. While Booth reveals his plan, he assigns roles to those around him. He looks at Powell and tells him it will be his job to wait at the bottom of the booth to catch a handcuffed Lincoln after he has been lowered from the president's box onto the stage. Samuel Arnold shakes his head in disagreement. He says that since Powell is clearly the strongest, that instead he should be up in the booth and he should be the one to subdue and handcuff Lincoln. Booth admits that his plan is not etched in stone and that he appreciates and wants this sort of feedback. This needs to go right. He needs to know what everyone thinks, and any ideas for improvement will be considered. The group of conspirators discuss plans all night, but the meeting quickly falls apart after Samuel Arnold stands up and whispers that trying to abduct the president in a theater full of people, most of whom will be his supporters, was damn near suicidal and would not work. That being said, everyone still wants to be involved with a plan to abduct the president. But at 5 a.m., everyone is clearly tired and they can neither speak nor think of this much longer. Booth says he will continue to formulate a plan, taking in everyone's suggestions, and they will discuss it again, and everyone agrees. They then leave the restaurant and disappear down narrow streets and into the early morning as each goes their own way home. 2 days later, during the morning of March 17th, the wheels begin to move in motion when Booth learns that President Lincoln is set to attend a matinee performance of Still Waters Run Deep at the Campbell Hospital on the outskirts of Washington, D.C. Booth assumes that the president might visit the cottage that he uses as a retreat to escape political pressure. This greatly pleased Booth because he knows that Lincoln usually visits there without an escort. Booth thinks this will be the perfect opportunity to intercept Lincoln's carriage en route and abduct him. At 2 p.m. that afternoon, the conspirators quickly assemble in front of the Surratt boarding house to await their instructions. When Booth arrives, he sends Harold out to the Surratt Tavern with equipment needed for the abduction. At the same time, he instructs the others that they should wait at a local saloon until he returns from scouting the area near and at the president's retreat. He soon meets some of the actors that will be performing for the president, and with great sorrow, they tell him that President Lincoln changed his mind about attending the play and instead would be meeting with soldiers from Indiana. When Booth returns to his fellow conspirators, they are disappointed, but they're confident that another opportunity will present itself, and they will be ready when that happens. 3 weeks later, on April 11th, President Abraham Lincoln announces that he wants to see former enslaved Americans given the right to vote. During the speech, John Wilkes Booth and Lewis Powell are standing on the White House lawn listening to each and every word. They are filled with fury. Booth turns to Powell and says,
"That will be the last speech he will ever give."
A few days later, at around 9 a.m. on April 14th, Booth meets with his fiancée, Lucy Hale. He then leaves and has his hair trimmed at his preferred barbershop on East Street near Grover's Theater. Afterwards, he briefly meets with Mary Surratt at her boarding house before returning to room 228 in the National Hotel where he has been staying. At or around 11 a.m., Booth grabs his walking cane, puts on a pair of bland-colored gloves, and, while dressed in dark pants and dark shirt and dark jacket, and with a tall silk hat upon his head and a light overcoat slung over his arm, he leaves his hotel and walks to Ford's Theater to pick up his mail. It is a cool yet pretty spring day, and during the walk, he wonders how much more famous he will be once his plan to abduct the president is accomplished. Leaving the president completely humiliated and perhaps even destroyed as a man and as a politician, and how the South will be able to rise from the ashes, and how perhaps a president of their choice will now run the United States. These thoughts bring great comfort to John Wilkes Booth. He is a man on a mission. He wants to do great things. He imagines himself to be a hero of historic proportions. Like so many people with huge egos, he imagines himself to be a hero of historic proportions. Soon after arriving at Ford's Theater, John Wilkes Booth learns from Henry Clay Ford that President Abraham Lincoln will be attending the evening's performance of Our American Cousin. Booth just stands there. He doesn't speak. He can't speak. A million thoughts swirl in his mind. He nods to Henry and then walks around the theater alone, thinking, wondering, planning. Booth thinks to himself, this is great news. Something can finally be done. This is his home. This is his territory. He knows every inch of every space around him. He also knows nearly every line of the stage play. Booth's eyes lighten up when, after some quick calculations, he determines that the greatest laughter in the play will happen about 10:15 p.m. Booth then starts thinking about the production. He realizes that actor Harry Hawk will be all alone on the stage at that particular moment. Yes. 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 Booth thinks to himself, yes, this is it. This is it. This is the opportunity that he has been waiting for. Tonight, at the time when the president will be laughing and others in the audience will be laughing, he, John Wilkes Booth, will assassinate the President of the United States. Booth quickly leaves the theater. At around noon, he arrives at a nearby stable and rents a fast roan mare. He says he'll return to pick up the horse later that afternoon. As Booth walks back to his hotel room, he is elated. The idea of abducting the president was fine by him, but assassinating him? Oh, that's so much better. He is surprised he hadn't considered it previously. Booth then stays in his hotel room for a while, sitting in a chair, running everything through his mind, how it will all play out. Who will do what, and when, and to whom? There is so much to do. It is nearly 2 p.m. in the afternoon, and there's still so much to do. And so, at 2 p.m., Booth walks to the boarding house where Lewis Powell is staying. He listens intently as Booth tells him of his plans for that night. He tells him that he needs to check out of the boarding house, because at the same time that Booth plans to kill Lincoln, he instructs Powell to assassinate Secretary of State William Seward. Powell nods his head and agrees to the plan. A half hour later, at 2:30 p.m., Booth and Powell walk to Surratt's boarding house. Booth gives Mary Surratt a package containing field glasses. Around a half hour later, at 3 p.m., Booth walks to the Kirkwood House, a 5-story hotel on Pennsylvania Avenue where Vice President Andrew Johnson lives. Also staying there, his fellow conspirator, George Atzerodt. Booth and George meet. Booth tells him his plan and says he wants Atzerodt to assassinate Vice President Andrew Johnson. George agrees, but he says he isn't sure if the Vice President is in his room or when he will even be in his room. Thinking quickly, Booth approaches the desk clerk and sends a message up to the Vice President. The note says, "I don't wish to disturb you. Are you home? J. Wilkes Booth." A few minutes later, the messenger returns. Johnson is not in. He is at the White House. That is fine, Booth thinks to himself. He will undoubtedly be home later. And so about an hour later, at 4 p.m., Booth returns to the stables where he was at earlier and picks up the mare he had rented. He then walks over to Grover's Theater, where he goes upstairs to Deary's Tavern. He sits down at a table by himself and has a strong drink. While there, he daydreams about all that will transpire if everything goes exactly as planned. He is hopeful that it will. Booth then walks downstairs and writes a letter to the editor of the National Intelligencer, a local Washington, D.C. newspaper. In the letter, Booth explains that his original plans to abduct the president had changed to a plan to assassinate him. Booth then signs the letter, but in addition to his own name, he also includes the name of 3 of his co-conspirators, Powell, Atzerodt, and Harold. At around 5 p.m., Booth goes outside and walks with the horse down 14th Street. When he reaches near Willard's Hotel, Booth briefly meets John Matthews. It is Matthews who will be playing the role of Richard Coyle in Our American Cousin. Booth gives Matthews a letter. He then asks him to deliver it to the newspaper the next day. Matthews assures him that he would. Satisfied that, so far, everything is going well, Booth ascends his horse and rides off. By an amazing coincidence, Booth passes by a carriage carrying Ulysses S. Grant, the commanding general of the Union armies. Booth now meets with George Atzerodt. He instructs him to kill Andrew Johnson as close to 10:15 as possible. Atzerodt reluctantly agrees. At around 6 p.m., Booth arrives at Ford's Theater. He is in a cheerful mood, and he also wants to solidify his potential allies at the theater. So he invites several employees of the theater out for a drink at a local saloon. It is clear that everyone likes Booth. He is very charismatic and likable. And he is very generous and attentive to everyone, whether or not they are as famous as he is. When he returns to the theater, Booth walks through his plan. He goes up and down the route through the theater that he will take. The only thing he cannot practice is his escape. He cannot do that without arousing suspicion. But he is strong and athletic, and he has taken leaps before. And so, he assumes, this can't possibly be too much different. Using a small hand tool, Booth drills a narrow hole in the door in back of where Lincoln will be sitting. He figures it might be helpful later in the night in case he needs to peek inside before entering. Booth then leaves the theater through the back door and returns to the National Hotel. He needs to get some rest and have dinner. At 7 p.m., John Wilkes Booth sits in his chair near the window, taking in a few deep breaths. And he puts on a fresh pair of black pants. He then sits back down in the chair and proceeds to put on black riding boots. These have new spurs on them. He then puts on a black frock coat and a black slouch hat. He stands there for a moment and then picks up his diary. He then walks over to a side table and takes his compass and a long hunting knife, which he sticks inside his pants on the left side. He then loads a .44 caliber Derringer with a lead back. It is a single-shot pistol. Booth knows how to use it. He's used it before, but never for such a nefarious reason. And tonight, he only has one chance to get it right. At 7:45 p.m., John Wilkes Booth exits the National Hotel. 15 minutes later, at around 8 p.m., Booth, Atzerodt, Herold, and Powell meet in Powell's room at the Herndon House. If anyone is nervous, they do not appear to be. No one wants to appear to be the weakest link. This is too important. The weakest link breaks the chain apart. They all need to be strong and ready. Booth reminds everyone once again what their roles will be. Lewis Powell will assassinate Secretary Seward. David Herold will accompany him there and then will help Powell escape since he does not know his way around D.C. George Atzerodt will shoot and kill Vice President Johnson. And John Wilkes Booth will kill President Abraham Lincoln. Everyone then synchronizes their stopwatches because all attacks will need to take place simultaneously at 10:15 p.m. That way, no one would be alerted of the other attacks. The President and the Vice President and the Secretary of State will all die at the same time. All involved agree this is a great plan and will most certainly work. It will cause chaos in the government and especially in the northern states. No one has ever done anything as bold as this before. Even killing Caesar was just killing Caesar. But tonight will be the destruction of the immediate line of succession. Oh yeah, they are excited. Tonight, they will make history. And once they are all done, they will meet at the Navy Yard Bridge, and from there they will ride to Surrattsville and pick up guns and binoculars at Surratt's Tavern. At about 10 minutes after 8 p.m., President and Mrs. Lincoln walk out the front door of the White House to their waiting carriage. Mary is wearing a black and white striped silk dress and a matching bonnet. The president is wearing a black overcoat and white kid gloves. Though the day started off to be nice and clear, it is now a foggy, misty night. On the way to Ford's Theater, the carriage stops to pick up their guests for the evening, military officer and diplomat Henry Rathbone and his fiancée, socialite Clara Harris. The carriage then proceeds to the theater. Clara Harris and Major Rathbone face the Lincolns riding backwards. Also in the carriage are Burke, the coachman, and Charles Forbes, Lincoln's valet. The carriage stops at Ford's Theater at about 8:30 p.m., meaning the play had already begun. The honored guests are greeted by the theater's doorkeeper and ticket collector. John Parker, the president's bodyguard, leads the presidential party into the theater and towards the state box. The play stops, and the orchestra plays "Hail to the Chief." People in the audience stand and politely clap. Once the president is seated, the play, Our American Cousin, resumes. The president's box is very comfortable for him and his guests. His chair is made of black walnut with red upholstery. It had been brought down from the Ford family's apartment, which is located on the third floor above the next-door saloon. Curtains are hanging from the top and pulled to each side. There are also large American flags flowing down over the front between elegant Greek columns. Outside the box, in the center of the two arches, hangs an ornate chandelier. Beneath that is a large frame photograph of President George Washington. Mary Lincoln is sitting close to the president and holds his hand. She takes great pleasure in witnessing his enjoyment. It is clear how lovingly she looks at her husband. At one point, around 9 p.m., while watching, President Lincoln feels a chill. Mary asks if he wants a shawl. He nods that he does not. Instead, the president stands and puts on his black coat. During the play's intermission, John F. Parker, the president's bodyguard, leaves the theater and goes next door to the saloon for a drink. He is not at his post when Act 3 of the play begins. Close to 9:30 p.m., John Wilkes Booth arrives at Ford's Theater. He calls for Ned Spangler to hold his horse in the alley in the back of the theater. Because Spangler was busy changing sets, he asked another employee, Joseph C. Burroughs, to take care of the mare. Booth then walks to the saloon next to the theater and requests a bottle of whiskey and some water. He stays in the bar, drinking the whiskey for about half an hour. At about 10:07 p.m., Booth enters Ford's lobby. He walks straight up the stairs, but moves slowly so as to not attract too much attention to himself. He then stops completely and leans back against the wall. For a brief moment, he considers all that is about to transpire. The liquor has steadied his nerves. He assures himself that this is no different than any other performance. He then walks a bit further until he sees Charles Forbes, the president's footman, seated next to the door. With all the confidence in the world, Booth approaches and hands him a card. Seeing that this is the great John Wilkes Booth and that he clearly has free rein to go anywhere in the theater he wishes, Charles lets him pass. Booth opens the door and enters the dark area in back of the box. Booth then realizes that John Parker, the presidential bodyguard, is nowhere to be found. He either never took his post or he abandoned his post. No matter, Booth is able to now walk straight ahead with no one to stop him. Booth props the door shut behind him with a wooden leg of a music stand which he had placed there earlier in the day. He then opens an inside door behind where the president is sitting. Seated next to the president is his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. In the next seats over are his guests, Henry Reed Rathbone and Clara Harris. Booth steps inside, slowly, quietly. This is the moment he has been waiting for. This is the moment he daydreamed about. This is the moment so many Americans from the South have daydreamed about. Booth thinks to himself, this man, this Republican politician, he freed the slaves. He allowed all the enslaved men and women to go free. He gave them hope. This Republican politician gave black men and women hope. He told them that this country is their country too, despite how they arrived here as slaves. He freed them. This disgusting man, this horrible, horrible politician. That's what Booth thought. He thought that the South has been devastated. He thought, how will the plantation survive? How will the economy survive down there? Where is the law enforcement as formerly enslaved men and women with no money and nowhere to go and nothing to do turn on those around them? Booth was wondering, what is the plan to clean up the mess that man had created? Booth wondered, how will the South survive if that man, that politician, remains alive? Oh, Booth thought, he has to go. For the sake of everything, because of all those reasons swirling around in his mind, Booth has convinced himself that President Abraham Lincoln must die. And that he, John Wilkes Booth, will be a hero. He will be the one to save the South and to take out their enemy. And so, Booth steps forward. He puts his derringer behind President Lincoln's head near the left ear. Then, just at the moment when Lincoln and others in the theater are about to burst out in laughter, he waits and waits and waits. And when the laughter begins, John Wilkes Booth pulls the trigger. The bullet enters President Lincoln's skull behind his left ear, passing through his brain, and comes to rest near the front of the skull after fracturing both orbital plates. The President of the United States slumps forward. But because of the laughter in the theater, not all patrons hear the shot. Major Henry Rathbone turns to see Booth standing in gun smoke less than 4 feet behind Lincoln. A terrifying scream from the First Lady can be heard throughout the theater. Henry Rathbone turns and sees what happened. He leaps up and begins wrestling with the assassin. Booth drops his derringer, but then he pulls out his horn-handled dagger and he stabs Rathbone in the left arm. Booth then pushes past him and climbs over the banister of the box, and while Rathbone grabs him again, holding onto part of his clothing, it causes Booth to lose his balance as he leaps down about 11 feet to the stage. And he lands off balance and snaps the fibula bone in his left leg just above the ankle. Rathbone cries out, "Stop that man!" John Wilkes Booth is now on the stage. His adrenaline is pumping through every inch of his body. To keep anyone from approaching him, Booth flashes his knife and he screams, "Thus always to tyrants!" Immediately after Booth landed on the stage, Major Joseph B. Stewart climbs over the orchestra pit and the floodlights, and he pursues Booth across the stage. Pandemonium breaks out as Booth quickly crosses the stage and exits through the back door of the theater. After jumping on his mare, he quickly escapes the area around the theater. Now, around this time, Lewis Powell was escorted to the Seward residence on Lafayette Square by David Herold. They knew that Seward was in bed recovering after having been injured in a recent carriage where he had suffered a concussion, broken jaw, broken right bone, broken right arm, and many serious bruises. Powell, wearing black pants, a long overcoat, a gray vest, a gray dress coat, and a hat with a wide brim, is armed with a Whitney revolver and large knife. As planned, Herold waits outside, holding Powell's horse. Powell knocks and rings the bell. A moment later, the door is answered by Seward's butler. Powell immediately holds up a small bottle and claims that Seward's physician had sent some medicine to the house. This simply doesn't seem right to the butler, as the doctor had departed the home only an hour earlier and left instructions for Seward not to be disturbed. So, the butler was immediately suspicious. He then asked Powell to wait. Powell figures this isn't gonna go well, so he pushes past the butler and races up the stairs to where the bedrooms are. At this point, Seward's son Frederick appears at the top of the steps and orders Powell to stop where he is. Powell says he's delivering medicine. Frederick asks to see the bottle. Powell approaches and then pulls out his revolver and pulls the trigger with the barrel of the gun against Frederick's chest. The revolver misfires, and so Powell begins to pistol whip Frederick over and over and over again until the poor guy is a bloody and beaten mess. From the bottom of the stairs, the butler sees and hears what is going on, so he flees the house screaming, "Murder! Murder! Murder!" Outside, David Herold is terrified, so much so that he ties Powell's horse to a tree, jumps upon his own steed, and flees the scene. Though this is not what he expected, Powell is still prepared. So he draws out his knife and bursts through Seward's bedroom door. Inside are Seward's army nurse, Sergeant George F. Robinson, and Fanny Seward. Powell slashes Robinson on the forearm and the soldier falls. He then punches Fanny in the face and leaps onto the bed. Powell savagely begins knifing Seward in the head and throat, but the blows are mostly deflected by the metal and canvas splint on his jaw. Powell does manage to cut through his right cheek and along his right throat, which causes a great deal of blood to flow out of Seward. Believing Seward to be dead, Powell hesitates in stabbing at him anymore. Just then, Seward's other son, Augustus, bursts into the room. Powell then attacks and stabs him several times. Robinson and Augustus Seward wrestle with Powell, who was very strong, and unlike them, uninjured. Powell then turns and stabs Robinson in the chest and shoulder and slashes a portion of Augustus' scalp from his head. As he runs out of the room, Powell shouts, "I'm mad! I'm mad! I'm mad! I'm mad!" like a crazy man. Once in the hallway, Powell is confronted by State Department messenger Emmerich Hansel, who has just arrived at the house moments earlier. He enters after he saw the front door ajar. Powell runs at him, and as Hansel turns to flee, Powell stabs him in the back. Powell then runs out of the house and throws his knife in the gutter. Seeing that Harold had abandoned him, Powell is immediately deflated. He simply is not familiar enough with the streets of Washington, D.C. to determine his escape route. Now, as far as the plot for George Atzerodt to kill Andrew Johnson, nothing happened at all. Atzerodt had a reputation of being a coward, and he simply could not muster the courage to kill Andrew Johnson. Instead, he went to a hotel bar and started drinking until he was heavily intoxicated. During the rest of the night, he walked the streets of Washington, drunk. At one point, he dropped his knife in a gutter, and this was seen by a woman who reported it to the police. At approximately 10:45 p.m., John Wilkes Booth crosses the Navy Yard Bridge. Soon, he will be in Maryland. At around 11 p.m., David Harold catches up with Booth. The two then ride together and head 11 miles south of the theater until they arrive at Mary Surratt's Tavern. Booth swallows down some whiskey to try to numb his mind of the pain in his leg. And the two men pick up field glasses and a Spencer rifle. Because his leg is hurting terribly, Booth needs to seek medical attention. And so Booth and Harold ride off into the dark countryside. They eventually end up at Dr. Samuel Mudd's house at approximately 4 a.m. They already know Dr. Mudd, and Dr. Mudd knows them. The doctor tends to his broken leg. Once done, John Wilkes Booth shaves off his mustache. Meanwhile, back at Ford's Theater, the first doctor to attend to the president is 23-year-old Charles Leal. After examining Lincoln, he sadly says, "His wound is mortal. It is impossible for him to recover." It is then decided to move the president out of the theater. His comatose body is carried out of the booth, down the stairs, out of the theater, and then across the street to the Peterson house. The president is placed diagonally on a bed in a small, neat room which measures 9.5 feet by 17.5 feet. A night-long death watch has begun. Nearly every leading doctor in Washington, D.C. stops by to offer help and assistance. Lincoln's pulse is 44. His breathing is heavy. He is cold to the touch. A large crowd gathers outside in front of the Peterson house. Word of a Confederate conspiracy to assassinate government officials reaches Secretary of War Edward Stanton as he waits anxiously near Lincoln's deathbed. The president's breathing grows fainter. The doctors felt an average man with this kind of wound would die within 2 hours. President Lincoln lasted for 9 hours. He passes away at 7:22 a.m. and 10 seconds, April 15th, 1865. Mrs. Lincoln was informed. She was told, "It is all over. The president is no more." Secretary of War Edwin M. Stanton said, "Now he belongs to the ages." And so this concludes this episode of Strange History and the story of the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Kindly like and share and subscribe and hit the notification bell. If you want to support my research, please click on the link below to make a donation directly to me. Please join me on Patreon, where I post exclusive content, as well as becoming a member of this channel. Please comment and leave a super thanks below. That really helps me out a lot. Kindly be kind to all non-human animals, and please don't eat them. They don't like it. And please do yourself a favor and go to a local shelter and adopt a cat or a dog. You and they will be very glad that you did. Until next time, my fellow time travelers and strange historians, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.